It happened with the suddenness of a backfire in a silent alley. One moment, the high-end kitchen hummed with the rhythmic clinking of silverware and the low chatter of the lunch rush. The next, head chef George D. Tenney had his finger shoved inches from Deborah Johnson's face. His voice a jagged blade of racial slurs as he lunged forward to pin her against the industrial prep counter. Copper heat lamps rattled overhead. The brick oven hissed, breathing orange fire into the tense air. Everyone froze. The line cooks, the prep hands, even the dishwasher. Everyone except Deborah. The black woman's eyes didn't widen with panic. She didn't flinch away from his reddened, screaming face. Instead, they locked onto Tenney with a cold, predatory stillness, as if she were looking through him at a ghost from a much more violent world. The kind of world that made this man's kitchen tantrum look like a flickering candle next to a forest fire. In the next 10 seconds, an event would unfold that would strip George Tenney of his arrogance, send shockwaves through the city's culinary elite, and force every witness to realize that the quiet waitress with the lion tattoo was the most dangerous person they had ever met. The first light of dawn touched the polished mahogany of the dining room as Deborah arrived for her shift. To the rest of the staff, it was just another grueling day of high-pressure service and dodging the chef's temper. They had no idea that by closing time, the hierarchy of the restaurant would be burnt to the ground. It happened so fast, no one had time to breathe. One moment, the high-end kitchen buzzed with the rhythmic clinking of silverware, the frantic chopping of herbs, and the low, pressurized chatter of the lunch rush. The next, head chef George D. Tenney had his finger shoved inches from Deborah Johnson's face. His voice a jagged blade of racial slurs as he lunged forward to pin her against the industrial prep counter. The copper heat lamps rattled overhead. The brick oven hissed, breathing orange fire into the tense air, while an open valve nearby whistled with escaping steam. Everyone froze. The line cooks, the prep hands, even the dishwasher. Everyone except Deborah. The black woman's eyes didn't show fear. They didn't beg for help or widen in panic as Tenney's face turned a violent, bruised red. His mouth open in a mid-yell that sprayed venomous insults. Instead, her gaze locked on him, sharp, steady, and unshaken, as if she were looking through him at a ghost from a much more dangerous world. Her posture remained military straight, her hands resting firmly on the stainless steel counter with a presence that made Tenney's explosive outburst look like child's play. It was the look of someone who had stared down real predators, the kind of monsters that lived in the shadows of the underworld she had once called home. In the next 5 seconds, something was about to happen that would strip George Tenney of his stolen arrogance, turn the restaurant's hierarchy upside down, and make everyone in that room rethink who Deborah really was. The air in the kitchen grew heavy, thick with the acrid scent of searing meat and the sudden, suffocating weight of a power shift no one saw coming. Tenney, blinded by a lifetime of thinking he was untouchable because of his position, mistook her silence for submission. He didn't notice the way her fingers curled slightly, or the way the lion tattoo on her arm seemed to flex as her muscles coiled like a spring. He believed his title gave him control over everyone else, and he was about to learn a lesson in the difference between bought authority and earned respect. The first rays of the morning sun had slipped weakly through the polished mahogany of the dining room hours ago when Deborah first arrived for her shift. To most, it had started as just another ordinary day in the endless cycle of service and stress. But now, inside the glowing heat of the kitchen, a chain of events was unfolding that would reveal the startling hidden past of a woman who, until that moment, appeared to be nothing more than an ordinary staff member. The first rays of the morning sun slipped weakly through the tall glass windows of the restaurant's dining room as the staff trudged inside, their conversations filling the foyer like background noise. To most, it was just another ordinary day in the endless cycle of service, prep work, and workplace gossip. But for the team at the restaurant, the atmosphere had shifted weeks ago with the arrival of Deborah S. Johnson, the new managerial staff member who commanded silence from the moment she entered a room. Not fresh out of training, not yet old. She was a woman with a sharp gaze and a calm presence that kept every waiter and prep cook on edge. Whispers followed her through the kitchen and the walk-in freezers. Too strict, too cold, too mysterious. Her appearance only added to the talk. Even in the sweltering heat of the kitchen, she maintained a perfect posture like a soldier, her white shirt pressed and her black tie knotted with a precision that seemed to read minds. Some said she was a widow. Others whispered she was hiding from a life she left behind in the city's darker corners. What none of them knew was that those rumors weren't as far-fetched as they seemed. The most striking feature, however, was the large lion tattoo visible on her upper arm. It was a fierce, commanding piece of art that reinforced her steady, unshaken presence, standing in stark contrast to the typical hospitality uniforms. As she moved through the kitchen, checking the earpiece that suggested a role far more serious than mere floor management, the staff watched her with a mixture of respect and unease. She didn't stumble when the pressure of a rush mounted, and she didn't flinch when the equipment rattled or the orders piled up. Instead, she met every challenge with eyes so piercing that, for the first time, even the most seasoned cooks felt uncomfortable. There was an invisible weight to her words, a finality that felt immovable, like a wall that couldn't be pushed through. To the workers watching from the background, Deborah was an enigma, a woman who moved with a precision and force that no ordinary restaurant employee could have possessed. They sensed she had lived another life before this one, a life forged in fire and experience that made the daily chaos of the kitchen look like child's play. Every high-stakes environment has one, the bully who believes he is untouchable, that rules are merely suggestions for the weak, and that those working beneath him are nothing more than tools for his own advancement. In the prestigious ecosystem of this restaurant, that person was George D. Tenney. As the head chef, he walked the tiled floors of the kitchen like he owned every soul within it, his tall white hat acting as a crown for a king whose throne was built on intimidation. George was a man of aggressive postures and a face that seemed perpetually stained a confrontational red, always leaning forward as if ready to strike with a pointed finger or a barked command. He mocked the younger line cooks, humiliated the servers in front of customers, and ignored safety protocols without fear of consequence because the owners valued his recipes more than the humanity of his staff. Most of the kitchen staff tolerated his outbursts or looked the other way, terrified of crossing a man who could end their careers with a single phone call. They had grown accustomed to the sound of his voice cutting through the chatter, a constant roar of "aha" and "what are you going to do?" that left his targets stammering or giving in to his demands. George was drunk on the power his position afforded him, believing that his authority gave him total control over everyone else in the room. He took a twisted pleasure in watching the sparks of arrogance in his own eyes reflected as fear in the eyes of others, relishing the way people shifted uncomfortably when he entered their workspace. But Deborah S. Johnson was different, and that difference was a thorn in George's side from the moment she arrived. She didn't stumble when he mocked her presence in his kitchen, and she didn't flinch when he raised his voice to a deafening scream. Instead, she met his aggression with a calm, steady gaze that made George feel an unfamiliar twinge of unease. To a man like George Tenney, who equated fear with respect, that uneasy feeling was an insult he couldn't ignore. He hated being made to feel small, and as the lunch rush began to intensify, his jaw tightened with a predatory focus. He began to watch her every move, waiting for a single mistake, a single crack in her soldier-like composure that would allow him to reassert his dominance and remind the entire staff exactly who ruled this kitchen. The air in the kitchen grew thick, heavy with the acrid scent of searing proteins and the humid weight of the industrial dishwashers running at full capacity. As the dinner rush hit its peak, the atmosphere became a pressurized chamber of clinking silverware and frantic movements. But the loudest sound remained George Tenney's voice, cutting through the chaos like a jagged blade. He moved through the line with a predatory restlessness, his white chef's hat bobbing as he leaned aggressively into the personal space of every staff member. To George, the rush wasn't just about the food. It was an opportunity to exert his will, to find the breaking point of the woman who refused to tremble at his shadow. He began his assault with a series of impossible demands, barking orders for inventory checks mid-service and screaming for table updates before the guests had even been seated. He watched Deborah from the corner of his eye, waiting for the moment her perfect posture would sag or her calm expression would shatter into a plea for mercy. "Are you really here to manage, or are you just playing dress-up to cover the rent?" he sneered. loud enough for the entire line to hear, his face flushing a deeper shade of confrontational red. A few of the younger cooks fumbled their knives, the tension in the room making their hands shake. But Deborah didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. She moved through the narrow galley with the disciplined precision of a soldier on a battlefield, her earpiece catching the frantic updates from the front of the house while she managed the flow of plates with a steady hand. When George purposely slammed a heavy copper pot onto the prep station right next to her hand, the metal rang out like a gunshot, but Deborah didn't flinch. She simply adjusted her black tie, her eyes remaining sharp and locked on the task at hand, a silence surrounding her that seemed to absorb his rage rather than reflect it. The more she ignored his provocations, the more George's jaw tightened, his pride acting as a poison that clouded his judgment. He began to weave more personal, biting insults into his commands, mocking her background and questioning her intelligence with a sneer that suggested she was beneath the very tiles she walked upon. He was a man drunk on his own perceived power, believing that his father's connections and his own professional status made him the master of her fate. But as he leaned in closer, his finger pointing toward her chest, he failed to notice the subtle shift in the room, the way the kitchen staff had gone quiet, their eyes darting between the bully and the lion who had not yet roared. Deborah's gaze remained piercing, a warning light he was too arrogant to see, as the simmering tension in the kitchen reached a point where the only thing left to do was boil over. The heat from the brick oven seemed to intensify, radiating a suffocating warmth that mirrored the mounting hostility between the two figures at the center of the kitchen. George Tenney's patience had finally evaporated, replaced by a reckless, ugly burst of defiance. He stepped closer, his face twisted into a mask of smug triumph as he realized that his verbal barbs hadn't yet broken Deborah's ironclad composure. He leaned in until his breath was a hot mist against her face, his eyes narrowing with a venomous intent that went beyond professional frustration. "You think that tie and that earpiece make you something special?" He spat, his voice dropping to a low, guttural rasp that carried a dangerous edge. "In my kitchen, you're just a diversity hire playing at management to fill a quota." The room went silent, the clatter of pans and the hiss of steam falling away as the staff froze in collective shock. The air felt charged, like the moment before a lightning strike, as George's words hung in the space between them. He wasn't finished. The poison of his arrogance had swallowed him whole, blinding him to the stillness of the woman standing before him. "I own this floor and my family's influence built this reputation," he sneered, his tone carrying a finality that suggested he believed himself immovable. "People like you are here because I allow it. You aren't my boss. You're an ornament I can shatter whenever I feel like it." He forced a grin to hide the sudden, flickering discomfort that sparked in his chest when Deborah didn't flinch. Instead of the tears or the stammering apologies he was used to receiving from those he bullied, he was met with a stare that was colder than ice and sharper than steel. Her eyes remained locked on his, dark and steady, as if she were reading the very depths of his cowardice. The ordinary staff member facade was beginning to dissolve, and in its place stood someone who had survived fires far hotter than those in a kitchen. George, mistaking her silence for a lack of a rebuttal, stepped even further across the line no employee should ever think of crossing. He gestured broadly at the kitchen, his voice rising again to reclaim his perceived territory. "This isn't your world, Deborah. You don't belong in a place of this caliber, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows it," he demanded, his finger nearly touching her collar. He believed his status and his father's money controlled the room, but he was about to find out that in this space, his influence was a paper shield against a storm he hadn't even seen coming. The tension reached its absolute peak, a single heartbeat away from a disaster that would change the restaurant forever. The air in the kitchen reached a flashpoint, the atmospheric pressure so high it felt as though the copper lamps might shatter from the vibration of George Tenney's rage. His face was no longer just red. It was a dark, bruised purple, his veins bulging against the collar of his chef's whites. He had spent the last hour trying to provoke a flicker of fear in Deborah, but her silence had acted like a mirror, reflecting his own ugliness back at him. To a man who equated volume with power, her composure was the ultimate act of defiance. It was an insult he could no longer process with words alone. Driven by a toxic cocktail of wounded pride and a desperate need to reclaim his kingdom, Tenny finally snapped. He didn't just point his finger this time, he lunged. With a guttural roar that silenced the last of the kitchen's ambient noise, he slammed his palms onto the stainless steel counter and shoved himself forward, using his weight to crowd Deborah into the narrow space beside the glowing brick oven. The heat from the hearth licked at the back of her neck, the orange flames casting long, dancing shadows across her face. Tenny's hand shot out, his thick fingers grabbing the lapel of her white shirt, twisting the fabric until the knot of her black tie was pulled tight against her throat. He slammed her back against the brickwork, the impact causing the ladles hanging nearby to chime a dissonant alarm. "I told you to look at me when I'm talking to you," he hissed, his face inches from hers, his eyes wild and bloodshot. "You think that lion tattoo makes you tough? You think because you've got an earpiece you're in charge? You're nothing but a ghost in my kitchen, and I'm tired of seeing you." The kitchen staff gasped, a collective intake of breath that seemed to suck the remaining oxygen from the room. One of the prep cooks took a half step forward, his hand tightening around the handle of a paring knife, but he stopped, paralyzed by the sheer intensity of the confrontation. Tenny was a large man, fueled by adrenaline and years of unchecked bullying, and he felt the familiar rush of dominance as he pinned Deborah against the heat. He expected to see her eyes dart around for an exit. He expected to hear her voice crack as she begged him to let go. But Deborah S. Johnson didn't move. She didn't struggle against his grip, nor did she raise her hands to pull his fingers from her throat. Instead, she leaned into the space he had invaded, her posture remaining unervingly straight against the rough heat of the bricks. Her eyes remained locked on his, sharp, steady, and utterly unshaken. It was the same look the chemistry teacher had given Dylan Ross in the lab, the look of a predator who had just realized their prey had made a fatal mistake. In that moment, the temperature in the room seemed to drop despite the roaring oven. The waitress mask she had worn so carefully for months began to peel away, revealing a cold, surgical hardness underneath. She wasn't looking at a chef. She was looking at a nuisance she had been trained to neutralize years ago, in a world George Tenny couldn't even imagine. The earpiece in her ear crackled with a faint, rhythmic static, a heartbeat of a life she had tried to leave behind. Tenny, blinded by his own arrogance, had no idea that he had just crossed the one line that guaranteed his destruction. He had initiated a physical conflict with the one woman who knew exactly how to end it in under 5 seconds. The shift wasn't loud, and it didn't come with a scream. It was a silent, terrifying transformation that seemed to suck the warmth right out of the brick oven. As George Tenny's fingers dug into her collar, Deborah S. Johnson didn't blink. The soft, professional mask of the waitress simply slid away, revealing a face as cold and immovable as a tombstone. Her eyes, which had been merely steady before, now took on a depthless, predatory sheen. The look of a woman who had spent years as the right hand of Carl L. Young, the most feared man in the city's underworld. She wasn't a victim being cornered. She was a professional assessing a nuisance. The earpiece in her ear crackled again, a tiny, rhythmic pulse of static that seemed to sync with the sudden, lethal calmness of her breathing. Tenny, still gripped by his own pathetic rage, felt a sudden, inexplicable shiver race down his spine. The woman he was pinning against the wall suddenly felt twice as heavy, twice as solid, as if he were trying to hold back an incoming tide with his bare hands. Her hands remained flat on the counter, but her knuckles had gone white, and the lion tattoo on her arm seemed to ripple as her muscles coiled with the precision of a hair trigger. In that moment, Deborah wasn't thinking about table rotations or inventory logs. She was back in the shadowed offices and velvet-lined rooms where a single misplaced word could mean a permanent disappearance. She had walked away from Carl to find peace, to wash the scent of gunpowder and expensive cigars off her skin. But George Tenny had just dragged her back into the dark. He had mistaken her desire for a quiet life for a lack of teeth, and the realization of his error was about to be visceral. The kitchen staff watched, paralyzed, as the atmosphere turned from a workplace dispute into something out of a crime thriller. The waitress was gone. Standing in the orange glow of the oven was the woman who had once managed the egos of hitmen and high-level associates with nothing but a whisper and a stare. She leaned an inch closer to Tenny, her voice coming out as a low, crystalline rasp that cut through the hiss of the steam like a wire. "You've spent your whole life thinking you're a shark because you swim in a goldfish pond, George," she murmured, the words so cold they seemed to frost the air. "But you have no idea what it looks like when the ocean actually comes for you." Tenny's grip faltered, his bravado flickering like a dying candle as he finally saw the shadow of the Mafia boss's ex-partner looming over his petty kingdom. Tenny never saw the movement. It wasn't a wild swing or a desperate push. It was the surgical application of physics and shadow world muscle memory. As his hand remained clamped onto Deborah's collar, she moved with a fluid, terrifying economy of motion. Her left hand shot up, not to strike, but to trap his wrist against her chest, while her right palm slammed into the underside of his elbow with the sound of a dry branch snapping. The air left Tenny's lungs in a startled wheeze. Before he could process the pain, Deborah stepped into his guard, her shoulder driving into his solar plexus as she pivoted. In one seamless blur, she twisted his arm behind his back and forced his face down toward the stainless steel prep counter. The impact was rhythmic and final, a heavy thud that vibrated through the copper heat lamps above. Tenny's cheek was pressed hard against the cold metal, his breath hitching as Deborah applied just enough pressure to the joint to make him realize that his arm was now a lever she controlled entirely. The kitchen staff didn't cheer. They didn't even move. The silence was absolute, broken only by the low hiss of the brick oven and the ragged, panicked gasps escaping Tenny's throat. They were watching a professional at work, not a waitress defending herself, but a specialist neutralizing a threat. Every line cook and prep hand saw the way she stood, her weight perfectly balanced, her eyes scanning the room even as she held their boss captive. She wasn't winded. She wasn't angry. She was clinical. Tenny tried to struggle, his legs kicking out weakly, but Deborah simply leaned more of her weight into the lock, a silent reminder of the catastrophic damage she could do with a single inch of movement. "You think your father's money can buy back a shattered rotator cuff, George?" she whispered, her voice a calm, terrifying contrast to his whimpering. The power dynamic of the restaurant hadn't just shifted. It had been eradicated. In the eyes of the staff, Tenny had shrunk. He was no longer the king of the kitchen. He was a broken man pinned to a counter by a woman he had spent weeks trying to humiliate. The man in the back who had been holding a knife slowly lowered it, his hands shaking as he realized he had been worried about the wrong person. Deborah looked up from Tenny's reddened, terrified face, her gaze sweeping over the silent onlookers with a chilling, soldier-like neutrality. She had shown them a glimpse of the abyss she had come from, a world where screams were ignored and only results mattered. The unshaken protagonist had finally dropped the veil, and the reality of her skill left everyone in that room breathless, rethinking everything they thought they knew about the woman with the lion tattoo. Tenny's cheek was pressed so hard against the stainless steel that a thin trail of saliva escaped the corner of his mouth, pooling on the cold surface. The arrogant fire that had fueled his morning was gone, extinguished by a terrifyingly efficient display of violence. He tried to draw a breath to protest, to shout about his father or his lawyer, but the pressure on his shoulder blade intensified with surgical precision, pinning the words in his throat. The kitchen remained a tomb, the only sound the rhythmic clack-clack of a cooling vent and the frantic, shallow gasps of a man who had finally realized he was outmatched. Deborah leaned down, her lips inches from Tenny's ear. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her voice was a low, melodic rasp that carried the weight of a death sentence. "You think you know what power looks like, George?" she whispered, her tone so calm it was chilling. "You think power is a title on a door or a bank account your father filled for you. But I've spent years at the right hand of Carl L. Young. I've seen men who own entire zip codes beg for their lives because they made the mistake of thinking they were untouchable." At the mention of the name, Tenny's entire body went rigid. The blood drained from his face with such speed that he turned a sickly, translucent white, contrasting sharply with the red heat of the kitchen. Everyone in the city knew the name Carl L. Young, not as a businessman, but as the ghost that ruled the docks and the boardrooms alike. The realization hit Tenny like a physical blow. The woman he had been mocking, the waitress he had called a diversity hire, wasn't just a manager. She was a survivor of a world where people like George Tenny were simply loose ends to be tied off. "I came here for the quiet," Deborah continued, her grip tightening just enough to make him wince. "I chose this life because I was tired of the noise. But if you ever bring your hands or your mouth near me again, I won't just break your arm. I'll make a phone call to a life I promised I'd never go back to. And when Carl finds out that a man like you thought he could put his hands on me, your father's money won't be enough to buy a casket deep enough to hide you in." She let the words hang in the air, cold and heavy as lead. Tenny's eyes were wide, darting toward the floor, fixed in a stare of pure, unadulterated terror. He looked like a man who had just seen his own ghost. The earpiece in Deborah's ear crackled with a faint, rhythmic static, a sound that now felt like a countdown. The price of disrespect was no longer a theoretical concept. It was a visible, shaking reality written in the sweat on Tenny's brow. She had pulled back the curtain on a reality he was never meant to see, and the sight of it had broken him completely. Deborah released her grip with a sudden, controlled smoothness, as if she were simply putting down a tool she no longer had a use for. George Tenny didn't spring back into a fighting stance. Instead, he slumped against the counter, his knees buckling until he nearly slid to the floor. The kitchen king was gone, replaced by a man whose trembling hands could barely find purchase on the stainless steel. He looked up at the staff, his eyes darting frantically, but he found no allies there, only the cold, silent judgment of those he had spent months tormenting. The power he had wielded for years hadn't been real. It had been a shadow that vanished the moment a true light was shone upon it. Without a word, Deborah reached up and straightened her black tie, her movements as precise and rhythmic as a soldier returning to rest. She turned her back on the broken chef, a final, crushing gesture of dismissal that proved he was no longer a threat worth her attention. Her gaze swept over the kitchen staff, and for a moment, the room held its breath. The man who had held the knife earlier slowly set it back on the prep station, his posture shifting from defensive to respectful. The atmosphere hadn't just changed. It had been recalibrated. The frantic, pressurized chaos of Tenny's reign was replaced by a heavy, disciplined silence. A new order born from the revelation of who Deborah really was. "Back to work," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, yet it carried to the furthest corners of the walk-in freezer. "Table 4 is waiting on their appetizers. The rush isn't over." The effect was instantaneous. There was no shouting, no ego, and no fear, just the sound of professionals returning to their craft. The line cooks moved with a new sense of purpose, their movements mirroring the quiet efficiency Deborah had modeled since the day she arrived. Tenny remained huddled by the brick oven, a ghost in his own kitchen, realized too late that respect isn't inherited through family money or bought with a title. It is earned through character, skill, and the restraint of someone who knows exactly how much damage they can do, but chooses not to until they are forced. As the dinner service continued, the restaurant shifted into a harmony it had never known before. The whispers about Deborah didn't stop, but they changed. They were no longer whispers of doubt or mockery, but of awe. They knew now that the lion tattoo wasn't just art. It was a warning. Deep inside, Tenny knew his life had changed in a way he could never undo. His shield of arrogance had been shattered by the one person he underestimated. Wealth had silenced many in this city, and it had even bent the rules for his father, but it couldn't protect him from the truth. Eventually, everyone meets someone who cannot be bought, someone who has walked through fires that would turn a man like George to ash. Deborah Johnson was that fire, and as she stood like a guardian at the heart of the kitchen, she proved that true power doesn't need to shout. It simply exists unshaken and absolute.